So thank you everybody so much for being here for the first ever Till Project Injury Roundtable Discussion. And we're just so delighted that you could join us. We're really hoping that this conversation can serve to share some really wonderful information about all of our experiences of injury recovery through the approach, and share some information with people who may be new to the approach on why it is so special, especially in the area of injury recovery. So I guess we will now start off with the first prompt, which is, what is/was the nature of your injury? And I can go first. I was diagnosed with musician's focal dystonia in 2018. For me, it manifested in my left hand. I had the sort of classic curling symptom. Let's see, the doctor who diagnosed me basically said, all I can do is give you Botox, which is sort of the standard course of treatment, medically speaking. But your symptoms aren't bad enough for me to do that now. So you should just go home and wait for it to get worse and come back in a year. And then I'll give you Botox. But he basically said, there's these other things that you can try, but they won't really work. And so you can just sort of teach. Yeah, luckily he was wrong. I consider myself fully recovered at this point, to the extent that I can, I've returned to my professional activities. I will pass it over to Ed. Go for it.
So I was also diagnosed with focal dystonia, in my case, by an upper arm specialist occupational therapist who do that type of work here in Australia. So I had a very bad fall saving my very pretty little dog from being run over. And that triggered a whole bunch of symptoms, which essentially meant that when I did an up bow on the viola, it was that classic viola joke of how do you get viola players to play 64th notes, you put a whole note with solo over the top of it. So on my up bow, it was just shaking. I couldn't even hold my bow steady, and it got worse the closer I got to the heel. So I've been working with Sophie now for a couple of years, and things have gone so well. I did a solo recital in September, and it was pretty good. But look, just being able to do a solo recital from where I was 2 years before, it's a changed world. So I think that, I know we're going to get onto this, but this method is extraordinary because I was in a mess. I couldn't do anything.
Well, shall I chime in, check in? So I have a partial rotator cuff tear in this right shoulder, which happened several years ago now. I'm not even sure exactly how many years ago, maybe 6 or 7, when I was trying to dig a trench in our yard. This tear seemed to be the cause, as far as I could tell, of a tremor in my bow arm, which is in some ways rather similar to Ed's. It was impossible to control. Other people seem not to notice it, but for me, it was really distracting and distressing. The tremor became worse during any kind of stressful performance. So I kind of tended to move away from playing anything where I had a solo. This afternoon, I'm going to be playing solo perfectly happily and really enjoying it. I went to a focal dystonia expert who turned out to be a former flute player, and she listened to my playing and looked at my hands and said, "I don't think you have the kind of anything that I would recognize as the kind of focal dystonia I can treat." And that's where I started Googling, and we can talk about that under another heading, if you like. But that's basically my history.
That's interesting, Peter. I'm trying to remember exactly how long ago this was. A bit of a blur, but I think about 15 or so years ago. I think over a period of maybe 2 years, I was having lots of pain in my right wrist and my bowing arm. And it was I guess I saw lots of physios, including lots of sort of musician physios that were around, and it was bothering me a lot. And including steroid injections as well, which didn't help actually. And I guess along with the injury, I now realize there's a lot of anxiety with it. But I guess, I mean, I always had pretty awful performance anxiety as well, but it was so inescapably together, those two things, that I always found them a separate thing. But actually, I look back now and realize they were quite intertwined, the whole business. Of course it is. It's a very confusing time. You're just trying to figure it out yourself with various treatments. So, I could say, yeah, I came across Therese, the lovely Therese. We got talking and she put me on to Sophie. And then we had Skype lessons for 2 years, I think, before I actually met. In retrospect, I probably would have, I would have wanted to have him in person earlier, but that's how it was at the time.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I was diagnosed with musician's focal dystonia in 2022 by two specialists. Actually, I think I've told that wrong. I think I was diagnosed in 2023, but I realized something was wrong in 2022. I'm not completely convinced to this day that what I've had is focal dystonia, but it sort of has some of those elements. It's definitely been a useful sort of label to give to myself and to sort of the few other people that I've shared my struggles with. It kind of onset quite slowly. It just sort of started with sort of slowness and tiredness in my hand. It would be sort of just not moving as quickly as I thought I remembered that it used to. I thought, oh, well, maybe I just thought I was better at the viola than I am. Maybe I'm getting old, I'm overworked, I'm tired, all these kind of things. And I just sort of put the viola down and said to my wife, I can't do this anymore. Something's wrong. There's, whatever coping mechanisms I've been trying, it's just getting worse and worse. It manifested itself as whenever I tried to stretch this finger out, it would sort of try and retract and kind of go along the finger next to it. There was no kind of what I think is kind of classic dystonic kind of movement, but there was definitely some sort of odd movement pattern that I wasn't used to and I wasn't in control of. I'm not quite sure what the nature of my injury was. I didn't miss any work, fortunately. I sort of bust my way through it, the best way I can put it, but I certainly wouldn't have played solo or auditioned, so it kind of limited what I could do for myself, but fortunately I was still able to sort of get through somehow.
I'll just share. I mean, I didn't have an injury in the same, tendonitis, one of these nice labels. But I would say as a youngster at music school, I did practice for 8 hours a day in a very high-powered environment, surrounded by a lot of high-powered young fiddle players. And I would get shooting, like an electric shock feeling up from time to time, up the side of my neck, and a sort of nerve pain in my fingers, not surprisingly, from doing that much practice. So a sort of random series of obviously not good symptoms. They didn't manifest beyond that. They would sort of pop up and go away again. But this was not a healthy environment to be in. And I was aware of that because people had said, oh, you mustn't play if you have pain, but nobody said what to do if you did have the pain. There was just this sort of weird, pain is bad. Okay, pain's bad, but what are you supposed to do with it? So there was nowhere to look for any kind of answer.
Great, thanks everybody. I think we sort of started to get into this next question a little bit, but we can delve it a little further, which is, what do you feel were the contributing factors to your injury, or may have been involved? I can go first. In terms of my personal situation, I definitely, when people are speaking about anxiety, I definitely resonate with that. I think that is a common feature of people with dystonia. But also, another thing that I've noticed comes up quite frequently with dystonia is I have very loose connective tissue. So obviously, the viola is a rather large instrument, and where the left hand is concerned, and I was just doing so much stretching of my left hand, right? Because we're typically trained to leave fingers down, and so therefore, what that means is if you're going to play whole steps, this fourth finger is going to be very stretched. So lots of stretching, um, lots of twisting. I had a pretty bad ulnar twist here. Lots of shoulder. I did Alexander technique for quite a while, which did help with my shoulder pain, but I had a really strong habit of sort of disconnecting from the shoulder. And so I do think that people with loose connective tissue, joint hyperlaxity, things like that are at a higher risk for playing related injury in general, but potentially also for dystonia, that structural instability.
I think ultimately for me, it was the inability or the what had been taken away from me by certain teachers was the way of playing naturally. I'd actually worked out a fairly successful way of playing naturally and then had a technique imposed upon my body where ultimately then I just didn't know how to even move. It's kind of shocking.
I also wanted to add on because I think that was a big thing for me is that I'd been a fairly sort of all over the place kind of young man, and I just kind of got to my early to mid 20s and suddenly decided I had to get better at this. And I had to started doing the hours. I started I've got to work hard at this. I'm not good enough. And then I sat in a room by myself for again these what I think are quite long periods, and decided that I had to have this hand shape. That was the solution to like intonation, to technical stuff, to being able to play octaves, thirds. I decided I needed this. But that's something that innately holds huge amounts of tension. And so I think that was a contributor to my injury. I just, as a sort of young man who wanted to do well, wanted to be better, was under pressure, I had adopted this method for myself with relatively little, nobody telling me that wasn't a good idea. I then pushed that technique really hard. So I'd adopted something that I've now learned is not innately a particularly smart idea, and then I'd really pushed it.
I just wanted to pop in and say, I identify with absolutely everything everybody's saying, actually, but the overriding thought seems to me that we all just feel really isolated, I think, in the end, don't we? I mean, you feel, especially when you get a job, I felt in a big orchestra initially, with all those notes coming at you all the time. It's like, oh yes, there's a sort of shutdown moment where you're like, I've got to look like I know exactly what I'm doing. And there's absolutely no support. And as I said earlier, that the only information you get is what not to do usually. Okay, I'm not going to do this. And then your brain sort of freezes up and you have to try and figure out something on your own, which can be wildly wrong, of course. For example, if I'm playing a soft passage and I'm already playing like this, then just like sucking the life out of the sound by like, taking the weight out of everything is going to actually contribute to an injury. Wouldn't actually have occurred to me, but of course it creates huge impact.
I think the whole idea of learning pieces when we're at school or in college, and you learnt your piece, but you didn't learn a toolbox of transferable skills that meant you could then go and play pianissimo, second movement, Haydn cello concerto, right, second violins or something like that. There was no transferable information, either from piece to piece or even from the technique that one was slavishly doing for hours, and then the music one was trying to desperately to play. There was this just total disconnect between all these things.
Thank you. This is so fascinating to hear everyone's stories. And one sort of frame that I'm sort of seeing around all of this, which I think is interesting, is there is, what we're actually doing with our bodies. There are like the concrete movements that we are employing to create sound at our instruments. And then there's everything else. And the everything else is like the teachers, the institutions, the conductors, the recordings, the orchestras, whatever. And those are all of these intense, sort of storm of contributing factors, the perfectionism, the competition, whatever it is. And I think what our sort of ethos as an organization is saying all of those conditions exist, and maybe we wish that they didn't. And maybe we can do what we can as individuals to contribute to changing them. But there is something that we can control, and it's everything that we are doing with our bodies at the instrument. And so to me, it's actually interesting to really concretely make a separation there. Sophie sometimes calls it knowing when to get off the bus. It's like when somebody's sort of talking at you and you're kind of like, okay, that's fine. You can say that. And I know in my body, because I've had this experience of working with this information and these tools, I know what I need to do in order to create the result that I want. Since I think we are sort of talking about the injury recovery process as well, what I would really love to do is shift a little bit to talking about what that process was like for each of us. How is it very different, almost certainly, from any kind of musical training that you received beforehand? And how also is it different from other injury recovery approaches? Because obviously, as many people have said, typically when we get injured, people tell us to rest or go to the doctor. They don't say, how are you playing your octaves or something like that. So,
and when I look back also on the treatments that I was sort of offered, and I think it's quite curious that actually nobody at any point said, like, gave me any sort of solution with the playing. There was, when you think about it now, it's quite crazy. You think you do this thing for hours and hours a day, but nobody ever said, what about the playing? Like, you need to do something different. Well, one physio said, oh, just don't break the wrist. As in, this is a traditional sort of, we need to play flexibly, so this has to be very flexible, which was causing the injury. So one physio said, just don't do that. And then it actually makes it terribly worse. My feeling was, okay, what do I do then?
I mean, one of the most wonderful insights that I think I got when I started having lessons with Sophie is to discover that my body already knows how to do a lot of stuff really well. And I'd always kind of assumed that playing the violin was this really awkward thing, uncomfortable, and you just had, if you wanted to do it seriously, then you had to kind of push through the awkwardness, the discomfort, and if it injured you, well, maybe you weren't meant to be doing it anyway. So the discovery that I could already do a lot of things that I really didn't realize that I could do, and I didn't know they were part of violin playing, was just liberating. One of the things that I discovered only quite recently with Sophie's guidance was that I can actually discern almost immediately when I'm playing whether I'm in balance, whether I'm in structure, or whether I'm off kilter and out of balance. It's almost like a sensation. And what an interesting sensation it is. No one had ever said to me before, just stop right where you are and tell me if you are stable, stability, right? What's your current sensation of stability? No one has ever asked me that before. And I've had some violin lessons where you do your scale, you do your study, you come back next week and you repeat. And that kind of observation, that kind of inner work focus has never, ever seemed to have come to the surface in that way.
So I had weekly lessons with Sophie for about 2 years before I felt ready to return to playing. And the first one was just the weirdest. It was the strangest. I'm sure we've all had this. It was the strangest lesson I've ever had. I played a scale, and then she said, okay, can you find a handbag or a backpack or something like that? And I was like, oh, okay. And so she had me plop the handbag on my shoulder and then on the other shoulder, and then do it a few times. And I'm like, this is over Skype. And I'm like, is she seeing something? Like, what am I doing? And obviously it moved on from there. So, I did not just plop handbags on my shoulders for 2 years, but it is what was really surprising for me, maybe this is especially a sort of dystonia centric process, is the extent to which it seems like what you're practicing has nothing to do with the music and nothing to do with the instrument. And that's what it seems like at first, because the brain and body have gotten so confused that usually the fastest route to actually accessing the very movements that we need on the instrument for the music, we have to get away from the instrument or with the other hand or something like that. But that is just wild. And I just still remember what an incredible leap of faith it was to just sort of, you're kind of putting your life in this person's hands in a way, and it is just so weird. Yeah, and then so that, and another thing was really interesting is we were talking a lot about time earlier, right? And the idea that on the one hand, investing a lot of time can be a drag. On the other hand, I think we get a tremendous sense of like identity or purpose out of it. It's like, I have to practice my 4 hours today, and then I was a good girl and I can eat my cake or whatever. But especially in the early stages of the process, there was really very little practicing. It was like, here's your list of 10 things to do, and it takes about 15 minutes. And how many times a day can you really do that? And then what am I supposed to do in between? And it was incredible to me to see how much my brain learned from doing 15 minutes of practice 3 times a day. And so, yeah, I mean, Mark, it makes you it just makes you think, yeah, like when I was 14 to 39, like Walton Concerto, what was I doing that whole time? Right. And now when you have tools, I think this is the great thing that comes out of going through this process beyond even the injury recovery. You get these tools that then you can go, all right, I'm going to figure out this passage. And then when you figure out, it's figured out. You don't have to practice it for 4 hours again tomorrow.
A lot of ways that we learn, they give us the pressure to do well, but not the tools to do it, to use. Here is some Sevchek violin exercises. They are on the music stand. Here's the instrument. You have to learn how to do that. So, but that's not a tool. That's not a tool for doing that thing. That's just the thing that you have to do. And I think a lot of teaching, a lot of technique learning is just actually setting goals. And then we're kind of on our own to figure out how on earth to reach those goals. We feel, well, we've got to reach that goal. How am I going to do it? I've got to figure that out. And I think a lot of us are kind of often failing our way through our training, because those goals, if you've got a goal and you've got pressure and you've got stress, but you don't have the tool to reach it, you may never get there. It may take from 14 to 39 to do the Walton Concerto and still not get there because you don't have a tool. And I think the thing that I found extraordinary about the Till approach was that it wasn't goal orientated. For the first time in my training, it was seeing how something works, seeing what happens. What happens if I touch my instrument? How does my body respond? How does my brain respond? How does this all work? I was free to work out what I'm actually doing, what my body is, what does it want? What does my brain want? And then I could go and have a little goal. I mean, at the beginning, those goals, like putting handbags on the shoulder, they were pretty like, small goals, let's say, pick up a cup and see what it feels like. That's a long way from go on stage and play a symphony. But they were, I was able to have these small goals that were actually, rather than just being things I had to achieve, things I had to fulfill, tasks, they were actually meaningful to me personally. It was me finding something that worked, and then I could stop worrying about it.
And my sort of handbag moment, as Nora was saying, was, I mean, when I had those 2 years of Skype lessons, and then I finally went to see Sophie. I think it was about 3 weeks or so, but I had 30 lessons in 3 weeks in person. or something like that, which is pretty wild when you think about it. And I had maybe 1 or 2 hours a day, I think it was. And I'd go to the woods and I'd be like rotating in the woods just by myself next to the stream, just going like this. I mean, if anyone had seen me, they would have like, what the? But I remember initially it was just that feeling of switching the brain to what you're saying, Peter, is I can actually trust what this feeling is and recognize that if it's a correct movement, it feels correct. If it's not a correct movement, it feels completely awful. And we don't power through it, which I did for 30 years. Is you power through these feelings, you dismiss them because you're going through moves that you think you need to do. But that switch which is incredibly tiring, actually. That feeling of actually, that there's like one of those, in a cartoon where they have the TNT and it makes like a where it's going to blow up something. It feels like that in your brain where it's burning those pathways. It's absolutely exhausting. And I remember being in the woods just rotating, going, that's right, that feels good. But wanting to go and have a lie down afterwards and being completely exhausted. And that's all I was doing, like 1 or 2 hours a day. But it completely flipped over my mindset into trusting my own feeling in my body and that it was right.
So I would say that if somebody had told me 10 years ago that I was going to get focal dystonia, I would have absolutely dreaded it and done anything to not get it. But now having it and making my way through it, I would say it's still hanging around, but it's definitely leaving. I would say that actually it's been one of the most important experiences of my life, that I've learned so much about myself, so much about my relationship with the viola, my relationship with music. It's rekindled my love for both of those things, and consequently, it's improved my relationships around me, and it's improved my teaching, beyond anything. And I'm so glad that I can, in my own small way, put the Till approach out into the world. So yeah, I think that if you're watching this video and perhaps you've just been diagnosed with focal dystonia and you're terrified and you can't see a way through, there is absolutely a way through. And I hope that at some point you'll be at the point where I feel that we are at, that we're grateful to have had it, because it's just in its own strange way, it's really given us so much.
Very well said. Thank you.